Hello, my name is Ken Coates. I'm the Senior Fellow at Macdonald-Laurier Institute. I'm responsible for the Institute's now very long-standing program on Indigenous people and natural resource economy. This last year, we've been doing a lot of work on Indigenous people in the oil and gas industry, in particular, working really hard to make sure that Indigenous people have a voice describing their issues, their concerns, and their priorities. We're doing a series of interviews with some very prominent individuals who played a leading role in their communities in pushing and advocating for the oil and gas industry and basically trying to figure out how to make sure that that sector responds to their needs, the needs of the community, and the aspirations of First Nations people generally. I'm joined today by a real favorite person of mine, Theresa Tait-Day, who is a leading light among the Wet'suwet'en people in the northern interior of British Columbia. Been an activist for a long time, very prominent in the energy sector, very prominent in her own community. Theresa, great to have you with us today.
Oh, thank you for having me, Ken.
Always my pleasure to talk to you. You know that. So let me start off with a simple question. When did your community first get involved with the oil and gas sector?
It goes back to really the Delgamuukw decision, and where industry was required to accommodate Indigenous people, to consult Indigenous people, and they have come to the office, the hereditary chiefs table, through the office of Wet'suwet'en, and through the band elected chiefs, where they've had to consult and accommodate Indigenous people through IBA agreements. And this is where we started to look at how we can engage for our nation, for not only impact benefit agreements, but how do we use the land, effectively managing it, to being on the land and looking at how the work is being done, having our people employed on the land, and while industry is working alongside. So that was our thinking back in the day. We've always wanted part of the economy.
Yeah. So listen, let's back up a bit. We're going to come back to the oil and gas industry and the sort of the issues that are sort of front and center in your community right now. But let's go back a little ways. We were just talking before we started about how much things have changed since the 1960s. So I'd be really interested in you describing sort of the relative power and economic role of Indigenous folks in Wet'suwet'en territory from the 1960s to the present. In one sense, it's only 60 years, but it seems like an awful lot has happened.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. I'd like to say I was on the front line with my grandparents, who were fishermen at the time, with all of the other Indigenous people at places like Port Edward and North Pacific Cannery. This is where we all grew up, and this is where our economy began, and this is where the meetings took place. And my grandfather was very good friends with late Chief Gosnell, Frank Gosnell, and they had many meetings about Aboriginal rights and what that meant. And throughout the years, thinking back on it, when the Indigenous people first encountered the outsiders coming in, who came in to take land and to put Indigenous people on reserve. Anyway, they at that time, our elders, they said, "We will help you." Because they were eating their dogs at the time. So our people took the white people in, and they showed them how to live in the Northwest. And then when the government came, they said, if you want to take a tree, then we have to be getting our economy from that tree. We want 1 cent from that tree in the development of that tree. And so that's the agreement that we've always had with Canada, is that we've always said, this is our right to the land. It is our land. You haven't killed us. That was the residential school effect, and we haven't sold the land. And those are the only two ways you can get consent to take the land. So as I know it, and that's what our ancestors knew as well.
Yeah. So, I mean, so what happens now? To contrast that, I mean, you grew up in a very different world than I did. I'm a non-Aboriginal person and grew up in a professional family in the Yukon. And the non-Aboriginal folks sort of had access to all the powers of government.
Mm-hmm.
When I talk to you about your community, you always tell me that your big driving priority in life is to get rid of poverty.
Yes.
And just if you wouldn't mind telling non-Indigenous people what poverty means in your community. You don't have very many visitors. Not many people come and see what the conditions are like.
The
So,
conditions are very poor. You know, there are people in our community that have come through the residential school effect. When we think we're all on the same page, you know, when you come here, we're not all on the same page. Every one of us have been affected by the residential school, and it's been intergenerational. And that intergenerational effect of residential school has diminished our people capacity in the mind and in the body and in the soul. And that happens. People commit suicide when they have no place to live, when they have no jobs. One thing that really, there needs to be changes in law that really reflect what is now a reality in our country.
You know, Theresa, I have been in your community and all the others in northern British Columbia,
Mm-hmm.
and it's such a mixed place because your community is also have such a powerful sense of togetherness, a powerful sense of community,
Mm-hmm.
The resilience, the determination to keep the traditions alive, the language alive, to keep the practices sort of in place.
Yes.
And at the same time, you know, such challenges facing young people. So how do you keep your personal spirits up?
I paint, and I'm on the computer a lot, reading things, and outside gardening in my yard. Those are the things I do. Yeah, getting out of town, going
Well,
into the
I'm
north.
glad it works. I'm
Yeah.
really glad it works for you, Theresa. That's really
Yeah,
quite remarkable. So tell me what the relationship between the Wet'suwet'en community and Coastal GasLink. So just for people who are listening, Coastal GasLink is the pipeline company that's building a pipeline from northeast British Columbia down to Kitimat, where it joins up with LNG Canada's liquefied natural gas plant. It is described as one of the largest, if not the largest, private project ever undertaken in Canada. A massive sort of big undertaking. 20 First Nations along the route signed onto agreements, basically saying that they supported the development of the pipeline, and a lot of the construction is underway. It's not finished yet, but a lot of it's certainly underway. So start at the beginning of that process with the Wet'suwet'en community and Coastal GasLink. It wasn't as though somebody just came into town one day and said, sign this piece of paper. I understood it was quite a long discussion.
Yes, it was a long discussion, and it started in 2014, I believe, when, like I said, there was an obligation to accommodate as industry the Indigenous peoples on the land, and so that requires a negotiation and talking about what is expected and what's on the table and that kind of thing. So that started in 2014. Because our Wet'suwet'en people live by a law, what we call Anuknu'eten, which is in translation meaning each house group has autonomy and control over their house system and their land system. In our case, we're from the Little Frog clan, and we have 3 houses within our clan system. So these 3 houses have lands somewhere on the territory, and they are attached to those lands. They go out berry picking, they go out getting their moose, and they are part of the land. And so part of our obligation as hereditary chief is to ensure that our boundaries and our lands are protected. And so that no other person from the outside can come into our house and tell us what we should be doing, because it is our land. It's like coming into your home and rearranging your furniture. Well, that's not allowed in our system and our culture. So that's what we call Anuknu'eten, which is, this is our business. We make decisions. We are self-governing and we are autonomous as a clan and as a house group. So this is the really the essence of the Delgamuukw case. Is that GasLink was the other plaintiff there who was with Sojin. So that's the essence of it. And so when we look at the rights and the obligations of the Indigenous people and through a hereditary system, my obligation is to ensure that that protection of those lands are, for my house group. And so we have to be involved in it. We have to be involved in that discussion. We have to be at the economic table.
Right. So describe for me, I've known you, first time I met you, you were introduced at a public event and you were described as a hereditary chief. So tell me how you became a hereditary chief. What's the process by which Theresa Tait-Day is recognized in her community as a hereditary chief?
Okay. This goes back again to my great-great-grandmother, who took the name Wehalite and handed her other name to her cousin. That Wehalite was passed down to her daughter, who is my grandmother. It passed my mother because my mother has her own name, Sana, which is also a hereditary name. So in my entire life, I was raised with my great-grandmother, Josephine Namox, who was Chief Namox's wife. Interesting story there is that he was called Alfred Namox. When the priest came there, his chief name was Namox, and they gave him the first name Alfred, and so he kept his hereditary name Namox. So that was my great-grandfather, who was married to Wehalite Josephine Namox. And then Sarah Tait, who was my grandmother, took the name Wehalite. And so the name is passed down through the family line. That is the hereditary essence of the name. Mm-hmm. So when it was my turn to get the name, and my grandmother had not passed away yet, and she was fearful that there would be some negativity in the community, was at that time I had just returned from Vancouver being the director of Legal Service Society Native Programs and wanting to help the community in 1993. And at that time, the treaty process began, and then, that the community was up in upheaval at that time. Before that time, our hereditary system was blank. There was nothing in it because the government hadn't recognized it. And so as we move forward to recognizing that Supreme Court case, and then the industries come to accommodate us, and as hereditary chiefs, we have that obligation. So when I got the name, my grandmother was still alive, and I sat beside her all my life through the feast system. And I was learning from her all the way. I speak my language. I was raised in the culture. I understand the feast system. I know the territory. My son was groomed from my hereditary chief, who was Pat Namox at the time, who was Widakwats, our house chief. Anyway, that's the process of learning. We sit there and we become hereditaries. When it was time to take the name, many of our families have died while we were holding this name. My grandmother and I, they called me New Wehalite, and they called her Old Wehalite until she passed on. And so when she passed on, we had the feast. I buried my grandmother. I took care of the feast business. I took care of all of the expenses. My name was recognized at the feast. I put the money in, and year after year, this went on because people were dying in my family, and through poverty. And so, as a responsibility, it was necessary for me as one of the hereditary name holders to carry out these obligations in the feast hall of bearing our people. So
that's a long, wonderful process. And again, I just ask you to sort of give us a bit of a comment here, because not a lot of people understand the richness and the depth of Wet'suwet'en culture. But the feast traditions are still alive. We're not talking here about something that disappeared when the fur traders came into town, or
Yep.
disappeared when the Catholic priest and Father Maurice came into the territory. You know, the feast is still alive, correct?
Yes, it is very much so. It is still alive, but damaged, somewhat damaged by this whole process, I must say, because names are, as I said, are passed down through the families only, and they're
Yeah,
there to protect the lands, and they're there to take care of the family. The richest chief is the poorest chief if you can give away what you have, and that's why the feast system was so wonderful. We loved giving everything we had away because it made people happy. You know, that
yeah,
people that didn't have things. You know, as a family, we put everything together, and we honor the father clan, and we honor the people that we are putting to bury. You know, so that's been the process with our feast system. It is very much alive, and it has ebbed and flowed now since COVID. You know,
right.
we've had elders have passed away. There have been uh, regrouping,
Yeah.
finding ways to do things.
So it's so important for me to hear about the feast system and to hear that these traditions and stuff are alive. But you also are really good about always telling people that even though things are better than before, that the legacies of the past sort of still weigh very heavily in your community. That the Indian Act, the role of the government, Department of Indian Affairs, you know, residential schools, that your communities have been very severely disrupted by these historical processes, and that even though the residential schools may be gone and we now have more Indigenous control than before, that the legacy is still an important part of your life. Is that correct?
Oh, it's very much so, Ken. I didn't realize how much it was until my own son passed away and he committed suicide. And I hadn't realized how I was affected by the whole residential school. And not I didn't go to that school, but my grandparents went to that school.
Right.
And I could see the you know, back in those days, Indians weren't loved and weren't cared for. And they got the message from the priests and the government that like Justice McEachran said, Indians were brutish and short. You
Mm.
know, nothing more than that. When the leadership has that kind of message out there, it's a detriment to our society and a detriment to our people. So we've been living with that kind of ideology, and people really have to check themselves and really understand that we're a very fragile people. You know, we're almost there to extinction if you think of the
Yeah.
language and the numbers that are involved.
Well, you know, Theresa, I mean, the last thing I would describe you as is fragile. I would describe you as immensely resilient, and in fact, the Wet'suwet'en as being immensely resilient. But I understand your point. The fact that these legacies sort of hang around and they shape the political tensions within communities. They shape some people who sort of take traditions and use them perhaps in the wrong way,
Yeah.
and you end up taking the frustrations that you have with Canada and the system as a whole, and they end up as being internal conflicts, don't they?
Yes, they do. They do. And they shouldn't be internal conflicts. You know, it is really about us. It's really about that going back to that one scented tree. It's really about being a part of the economy. Because if we can look after ourselves and if we can provide medical and education and housing and childcare and the things that we need to be a thriving community, if we can do that, we can be a very happy people because poverty kills, Ken. And my son was an example of that, and many Indigenous men and women have been examples of that historical oppression, historical, and it has been internalized by Indigenous people, and that we act out in these ways with no help.
Right.
You know,
Right.
government comes here and they want to negotiate, and it's like negotiating with us with our hands behind our backs and blindfolded
Yeah.
because we're not all on the same page.
Well, you haven't had time to recover, correct? I mean, you haven't had time to, as a community. I look at the Wet'suwet'en communities. They're a First Nation. They have a rich culture that is thousands of years old since time immemorial. Mm-hmm. They have these deep roots in the land and deep roots with other First Nations in the area. and yet you're hurting, and you're hurting not because you're not smart, not because you aren't strong, not because you're not determined, but
Yeah.
you're hurting because you have these oppressive elements. I remember when they were closing down a residential school in the Yukon many years ago, back in the late 60s, early 70s. And people would comment, non-Aboriginal people at the time said, well, that's the last we're going to hear of residential schools.
Yeah.
So, if they were a bad thing, at least they're closed now. No, these things take generations to work out. So tell me then, in the context of this wonderful and painful history you've shared, where does the Coastal GasLink pipeline fit in? Because your community, the Wet'suwet'en people, signed on with Coastal GasLink. You're one of the 20 First Nations that agreed to the project. I understand there was actually considerable enthusiasm in the community when the project was first announced.
Yes, that's right. All of our bands, like band councils and chiefs, have signed all of those agreements in the past. The Coastal GasLink has come to the hereditary table to sign that agreement. That did not happen. They, however, have signed with all of the bands and are moving ahead with the project. Given that COVID has hit, I guess there's all kinds of restrictions. Americans have gone home.
So when you say that, it's important, I think, to tell the story that the pipeline is not just something that's coming through the community. There's actually some economic benefit to the community from being involved with the pipeline. What kinds of economic returns do the Wet'suwet'en people expect to get out of the pipeline project?
Well, I don't know what the accumulation is, but if you look at all of our bands who have signed already, they have signed. I don't know what the numbers are. There's all kinds of numbers, but it doesn't really measure, Ken. This again is just an impact benefit agreement. It might be 10 million, 20 million, but that is nothing. And that is just a pipeline. That's just to rent the pipeline to go through our territory. And I'm in favor of that, and I've said that, and that's fine. That's fine. And when that happens, I always ask myself, wow, what about other resources that want to come through this area? How do we make that happen? Because the benefits have to flow. But we don't want an impact benefit agreement, Ken. We want to be partnership, and we want to have equity stake in these projects. We try to, as a community, have an equity stake in that pipeline, but we weren't allowed to. So because for whatever reason, I don't want to get into it.
Well, that's such a complicated part. And again, it's important for people who aren't familiar with the Wet'suwet'en situation and with Indigenous interests in pipelines and oil and gas development generally, that the idea of equity is emerging as a much more important part. And it's always interesting to see these things in layers. When it first started, the companies sometimes would give small allocations to the communities, help you build an outside hockey rink or something like that. And then the impact and benefit agreements come along because of the duty to consult and accommodate, and you get better deals. You get some contracting work, and you get some training and things of that sort. But it seems to me that the message that I've heard from you over and over again is that Indigenous people want and deserve and demand an equity stake in these projects. They want the long-term financial benefits from the resource extraction.
Absolutely. When you look at an analysis of a pipeline that could be the PTP, for example, you look at a strawman analysis of that project, and you can see that to the Indigenous people, that project would yield $6 billion. Out of that $6 billion would be a debt of $3 billion. If you divide that profit of $3 billion amongst the 20 communities, that's going to take care of a lot of the problems within our nation, dealing with health and education, housing, the very fundamental things. Everybody just to have a roof over their heads and everything else, right? So this is really what we are about, is an Aboriginal right. That is inescapable benefit. We're talking about through that Dalgamuka decision. That is an inescapable economic benefit. And we want to do that in ways that are profitable. We are tired of taking these little few $1 million called impact benefits They only go so far. We have to have ownership and an equity stake in any project coming into the territory.
I love the way you put that, because that's such a positive and sort of nation building story, in the sense that when I look at this and across around the world, that when Indigenous people are involved in a resource project, and the more they are involved in the research project, the economic impact on the area actually multiplies. Yes. So you could have somebody come through and build a pipeline through your territory like they used to do, 40, 50 years ago. The net economic benefit would have been very small, and little money would stay in the area. But if your community has that much money and they're able to build houses, they're going to hire local people, local businesses. If they're going to eat better food at the store, they're going to buy the food from the local store. They're going to hire local people to work in their firms. The benefits just become so much greater and so much more entrenched. So tell me the biggest puzzle now. And I love the way you've described your involvement. And this is, you're not somebody once said that Indigenous people who favor pipelines are patsies in the hands of the corporations. And I've known you long enough to know that the last thing in the world you are is a patsy. You're not going to be pushed. You're not going to be pushed around.
That's right.
If you ask the people across Canada about the Wet'suwet'en interest in the pipeline, what would they tell you? If you ask people in Toronto,
well, they're misinformed, for one. I mean, where we're at is really a Supreme Court decision, and we're trying to implement that decision in a way that's going to be beneficial. We don't want those impact benefit agreements to be the end all and be all. We want to have equity stake in those projects, and that's where we're at with those things. We can't do it any other way because our people are dying.
Yeah. Well, it makes so much sense. It makes so much sense. So right now, the Wet'suwet'en are sort of a focus for controversy around the pipeline. And people in Victoria and Vancouver, Toronto, Montreal were protesting on behalf of the Wet'suwet'en, but they weren't actually supporting the wishes of the communities as a whole, were they?
Oh, absolutely not. They had no idea. They thought somehow this was an infringement of our rights, and that we were all on the same page, and that we all agreed with this protesting that went on. In fact, there was very few of our own people out there in the protest line. Many Americans came, and later on we found out that they had their own agendas to really stop the pipeline. And this goes back to the Americans having control of the oil and gas industry way back for 100 years. So, it goes back to have poverty again, because people were paid to be out there, as I understand from, I don't know if it's fake news, but but anyway, it is a system really against Indigenous people. I don't know, we have been used, Ken, throughout. We haven't been allowed to play ball.
Yep.
And we have been used by the environmentalists, the government. Many of the first time the pipeline, Coastal GasLink, somebody came knocking at our door and said, hey, we want to give you a share, But we don't necessarily know how to do that. And we all need to be on the same page of how we're going to move ahead economically as a nation.
So if you could do one or two things, because I completely agree with your description of sort of the way in which the world is making your life more difficult rather than better. When people outside speak on your behalf and say, shut down the pipeline because we support the Wet'suwet'en, they haven't really spoken to the community, have they? Right? And if we're going to support the hereditary chiefs, well, you're supporting some of the hereditary chiefs. I don't think they're supporting you in that particular process. So if Canada as a whole was really going to assist, the Wet'suwet'en people in the challenge in front of them, the broad challenges in front of them, what would you want Canada to do?
Oh, well, I guess I would want Canada to include Indigenous women in the Constitution, respect our constitutional rights as Indigenous women. We have a right to our voice. We have a right to equality, and we cannot be treated in a manner from what I described earlier was Justice McEachran's attitude about Indian people. We can't have our leaders doing that to Indigenous women. That's it. No.
Yep.
So I would have to check their policies in terms of how they're engaging with us as a nation. We are not a thing. We are somebody. We are Wet'suwet'en women, and we are Indigenous women, and we have been marginalized in this whole process. We tried to have a voice, and we were squashed by government and by industry and by our own community.
Yeah, and I remember we had a talk about this one time, and your comment was that your community needed breathing space. I think was the phrase you used, that they needed time and opportunity to sort of, come together as a people and form their own government and modernize their government system. So right now you have two systems, right? You have a very important hereditary chief process, and you have a band council process. Some things have to go through the band council, elected band council, chief and council. Other things have to, for cultural reasons, go through the hereditary chief. And some communities in British Columbia have sort of, the word is merging is the wrong word, but they reconciled them. They've made these two systems work together. And it seems to me that that's what the Wet'suwet'en need, is they need time and space to actually determine their own future.
Yes, I would say that. I've actually met with Minister Bennett, and I asked her the very same question. I said, this really is an internal issue. It is really about a governance issue, that we have to be able to establish a governance that is inclusive of the 5 clans and the 5 bands, and have a system where, like any government, there's infrastructure supporting the system in terms of information flow and how information gets out there and how decisions are made and how those things are tracked and how the nation is going to engage forward with who are they going to speak with and who's going to be at the table. It's a very fundamental thing that needs to happen. I've been harping and singing this song so long. I hope it's heard, because if had we not gone through this process, I don't think we would have come to this realization to such a way that it has to be public, and that we as a nation must work together to form this Wet'suwet'en central governance, so that we're all included and we all know what's going on, and that we're all part of the decision. When industry comes in, our people should be working on the ground first. We're the ones that are going to benefit. But also we should be able to buy an equity stake in any project so that we can help our people get out of poverty and live a good, happy life.
Well, that is a wonderful way to finish our conversation, Theresa. That's really powerful. It's a beautiful description of what has to be done and what must be done. I wish you all the best in your work. You're a very passionate and powerful defender of Indigenous women's rights and First Nation rights, and particularly the rights and opportunities of the Wet'suwet'en. And I wish you the very, very best in all of your efforts. So on behalf of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, thank you very, very much for speaking with us today and for being part of our series. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Ken. I enjoyed it.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye. Take care.